Welcome back. We'll now take a look at the actual contraction of the heart and the pumping action of the heart muscle itself and how we get that to move blood through the heart. So the pumping of the heart itself is a process because we have a four-chambered heart. We have essentially two chambers that need to be filled on either side of this pump process. We need to be able to make sure that the atrium have completely filled the ventricles before the ventricle starts to contract. And so we have to have the atria contract completely and move all of the blood from the atria down into the ventricles before that occurs. And we talked about that a little bit last time as well in terms of the AV nodes delay. And so in order to make sure that we get that blood to fill the ventricle so that we're not pumping a partially filled ventricle with each contraction, we need to make sure that we're taking and slowing down the process in a sense from getting the action potential from the atria down into the ventricles themselves. And so this is going to help out with that process of making sure that we have nice, efficient blood supply throughout the heart itself. And so again, we have that non-conductive fibrous connective tissue in the middle of the heart in a sense. That's going to help with that delay there because it's going to make sure that any electrical activity that is coming through the atrium essentially kind of gets blocked off. And so it's not that it really bounces off there at all, but it is going to be stopped at that point. And that allows for that little bit of delay that occurs within the AV node to take effect. So now the atria are contracting, they're pushing in, pushing that blood down into the ventricle before the ventricle is actually going to contract. And then after that moment, then the AV node will fire off, send it down through the bundle of His, and then back up through the Purkinje fibers. And so we get that electrical activity delayed there momentarily to make sure that we have complete filling of the ventricles for the next contraction that is there. The individual cells themselves of the muscle are going to be able to contract. You can almost think about it as kind of like being dominoes. And so it is, in a sense, a contracting as a single unit as that action potential quickly and easily moves from one cell to the next. And so those ions are going to be able to move through those open channels as they make their way from one cell to the next cell within there. When those channels are closed, then they're not going to move quite so easily. But it allows for that action potential to jump from one cell right into the next cell, and we get this wave of contraction, at least for the ventricles, moving from the apex back up towards the base of the heart. And so in a sense, if we were to kind of look at the heart here, so to speak, we initially have our contractile wave in the atria moving this way, and then the ventricles move it back up this way because the blood itself is going to move from the base of the heart and then come back up and then go out of the heart in that direction there. And then for the other side, come down from the atrium into the ventricle and then back out as well. And so we need to have that efficient movement of those electrical potentials from one cell to the next as we send that electrical activity from the AV nodes down through the ventricles themselves. If this process is not happening when it's supposed to, and so when things aren't really happening as they normally should, then we're going to have the potential for a part of the heart, typically either in the ventricles or in the atria, to be contracting kind of out of sync. And so when we have this, we call this a fibrillation. So essentially we can kind of think about this as oftentimes either the atria or the ventricle is contracting when it shouldn't. And so when this happens, we have essentially a disconnect in the number of action potentials from the atrium to the ventricles themselves. And so either if it's a atrial fibrillation, it's happening to where the atria is contracting very, very quickly. So maybe it's contracting 5 times for every 1 time that the ventricle contracts. But when it's ventricular fibrillation, now that ventricle is contracting much, much faster than that of the atrium. And the ventricle is relying upon the atrium to get the blood into it. And so essentially what this amounts to is that the atrium is contracting, say, once for every 5, 10 contractions of the ventricles. And so each one of those contractions is getting a fraction of the amount of blood leaving the left ventricle from where it normally should. And so it's not going to be leaving there when it normally should. And so in order to counteract this is where defibrillation is needed. And so we need to be able to defibrillate the heart, apply that electrical activity to the outside of the heart through the body, and that allows for that to occur. And it gets the kind of resets the electrical activity that's happening in the ventricles or the atrium. If it's happening in the ventricles, this is a very life-threatening process. This needs essentially immediate cardioversion. We need to convert them back into a normal rhythm. And this is where when you watch like TV shows and movies, most of the time, in a sense, they get it wrong. Because when you're watching there and then you're listening to the monitor and it's going beep, 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 and then all of a sudden they flatline, that's when they're usually going to then apply that defibrillation. But if the heart has no electrical activity, there's nothing to defibrillate. There's nothing to get them out of that fibrillation. It's a defibrillator. It's designed to take them out of that abnormal activity. If there's no activity, there's nothing there. It's not a car that we're jump starting. We're not applying that electrical activity to get the heart going. We're applying it to get them back into a normal rhythm. And so that's what we're trying to do there with that defibrillator itself. In order to maintain that contraction that's happening there as well, we need to have the cardiac cells kind of slow themselves down. And so they have a prolonged contraction. And so back when we were talking about skeletal muscle, we said that some of our fastest skeletal muscles can have a contraction in the neighborhood of 10 milliseconds. And so their contraction and relaxation phase is very, very short. But for cardiac muscle, that can be upwards of 300 milliseconds. And so the process here is going to kind of slow down the contraction in a sense and make sure that the heart chambers are emptying at their most efficient. So that allows for this slow contraction. And this is helped out by things like our calcium channels. And so the calcium channels themselves are essentially slow to allow the calcium to move from one cell to the next. And so as it goes through that membrane, it's a slow process. And so remember, back to the actual contraction of muscle, we need that calcium to bind to the troponin, to move the tropomyosin out of the way so that we have a binding site for the myosin. And if we slow this process down, that's going to take even longer for the muscle to then contract. And so this is going to allow for us to make sure that we get all of the blood out of the ventricles that we need to, so that it's not just kind of doing it too quickly and not necessarily getting the blood out that should. In addition, when it came to looking at skeletal muscle before, we talked about summation and tetany in skeletal muscle. And this was where, as we applied a stimulus, we got a stronger and stronger contraction as it went along. So we went through a summation. And then we may have also gone through a tetany where we came up to a maximal contraction. And so the contraction occurred after we applied it, and the number of stimuli that were being applied was just too quick. It was very fast stimuli. Here we had a stimulus, and then a stimulus, and then a stimulus, and a stimulus. It was slow enough to where it was increasing in the strength of contraction, but not causing that tetany. With tetany, we're going to have sustained contraction. The muscle is going to be shortened, and it's just going to stay there. It's not going to relax at all. With the heart, we don't want that. We want the heart every single time that it contracts. We want the heart to be able to relax. And so the heart needs to go through this process where it goes through contraction and relaxation every single time. And so the heart muscle, no matter how much, in a sense, we stimulate it, it's going to always go through that contraction and relaxation. So we're not going to get summation. We're not going to get an increase in contractility. We're not going to get tetany, that sustained contraction of the muscle. Every single time that it is going to have a contraction, it needs to be stimulated at that point. And so we're going to have that stimulation there every single time that we have a contraction desired. And so here we have, just in the next couple slides, a look at that refractory period that is occurring within the muscles themselves. And so in the top picture, we have the process of the action potential occurring. And so that's the electrical activity that's there. In the bottom one, we have the muscle tension that is being generated. And so we can see that even though our action potential was started at the 0 time, we don't get contraction for a little bit. We always have that lag time. And so we have that lagging period in the beginning, and then we start to get actual contraction of the muscle. We go through contraction, and then we get relaxation. And then relaxation comes back down from there. And in this one, all of that is done within about 75 milliseconds. Everything has completed at that point. The refractory period is relatively short. If we were to hit it with another stimulus in here, we would then see summation. We would allow for that muscle to start to contract even stronger than there was before. With cardiac muscle, the contractile phase is slowed down. And so it's a long kind of progressive contraction that is occurring there. The calcium ions are moving through the cell relatively slowly. And so this is a slow movement as it's going through there. So we have a long absolute refractory period for the muscle itself where we can't get any contraction for sure. And then at the same time, the relative refractory period is quite long as well. And so we're almost done with relaxation here by the time that we ever exit the refractory period. And so this is going to prolong that contraction. We're going to have a nice, long, smooth contraction for the muscle itself. And we're never going to be able to get a summation or a tetany of the muscle itself. And so this allows the muscle to work a little bit different from the others. We haven't really covered everything in cardiac muscle, just wanted to kind of compare it with that of skeletal muscle in terms of its physiology here. We'll go into a little bit more detail in the next unit as we continue on into the cardiovascular system itself. And so we'll get a little bit more deeper into the actual electrical activity and the physiology of the muscles as we continue into our next unit in just a little while. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.